Hi everyone. Today I wanted to explore with you guys postcolonial thought. It's an intellectual framework that helps us explore our history, helps us understand how imperial legacy continues to play a role in our present, because it goes beyond just history, of course. It talks about cultural identity, linguistic paradigms, political organization, cultural identity, political identity, in formerly colonized societies. So, to begin with, we have Edward Said's notion of Orientalism. It was in his book that was published in 1978 that has the same name as the concept. And he basically spoke about how the West always had a patronizing image of the East. We can see this in notions of depictions on news or in films, where there is just a simpler, dumbed down version or an oversimplified version or notion of the Middle East and Asia. You can see this in British and French literature as well, where the East is seen to have mysterious cultures, it's seen to be backward, and creating such a notion of somebody else's culture then gave them the way to be able to say that, you know what, domination is okay, because us intervening in these lives will lead to them becoming civilized later. So basically, by framing the Orient as the opposite of rational, it justified dominance, and then that gave way to colonialism. So the first thing we need to be doing is that we recognize that these are biased narratives and then challenge the Eurocentric vision of the world that sees the West as the universal norm. We start with this concept first because this then gives way to the post-colonial thought of asking the question of whose perspective are we seeing at the end of the day when we look at the world, or what has been holding back countries from reclaiming their past and redefining their histories. Um, this challenging the Eurocentric notion of the world and reasserting your own voice is a notion that's going to keep reiterating itself throughout this video, and I think you guys will be able to keep up with the trend by the end of this. Even after the last formal colonial governors' ships have sailed and the final colonial flags were lowered, the point is that colonialism didn't end when these people left the countries. It continued to take on subtler and newer forms. Kwame Nkrumah was the name of the first official president of independent Ghana. And he coined this term of neo-colonialism that refers to the external dependence of a nominally independent country through pressures which could be economical, social, or cultural. Um, you see this in the form of how formerly colonized states continue to be dependent on wealthier nations, either by importing manufactured goods or exporting raw materials or depending on foreign capital or aid. So it goes on to say that your countries may be independent on paper, but they are still subservient to wealthier nations. And Nkrumah warned that this new colonialism could be even more insidious because it exists under the guise of freedom in ways subtler forms that would be more difficult to erase, because now it's turning from some sort of a hard colonialism into a soft colonialism. So what does neo-colonialism look like? It could look like economic imperialism, where a country is dependent on international financial institutions for its well-being. It could be in the form of cultural influences, where Western notions and Western media is still inundating the country's culture and the way things work around there. It could be seen in unequal trade agreements. It could be seen in exploitative conditionalities that come with foreign aid at the end of the day. In all these cases, you see this trend of wealth being continued to be shifted from the periphery, which is the developing states, and keeps going towards the core, which is the developed states, and it continues the same age old trend of the drain of wealth from the developing to the developed. It's important to understand that post colonial thought does not just describe this reality to us, but it also allows for us to respond to it, especially in the form of resistance to it. One of the more popular responses to post colonial thought to neo-colonialism was the non-alignment movement during the Cold War in India, where India chose to side with neither of the Western centric superpowers and chose to maintain its own autonomy and that furthered itself in the form of the Look East and the Act East policy of the 1990s, and that trend has continued into modern alliances today when you look at the G4 and the BRICS. Now, the point is that whether in economics or in culture, post colonial thought is forcing us to shed this sort of a colonial hangover which continues to exist in countries despite independence. And that could exist in the form of a purely English speaking elite in most countries, or that could be in the form of Western norms of governance that continue to exist within the country, or some sort of an or some sort of an inherited colonial logic. For example, in India, we still consider the ones who speak in English and converse in English to be a part of an elite that can communicate better and have better access to opportunities rather than those who continue to speak in Hindi or even worse vernacular languages. And I say this worse in quotations. Now, one of the most profound examples of colonial legacies when we're talking about colonial hangovers is the presence of these institutions in the modern state. Now, under colonial rule, when these institutions were built, I'm talking about the military or the bureaucracy or the legal systems that were created, they were designed in such a way in order to upkeep the same trend of domination that had been existing for decades before that. Now, the point is, when the colonizers left, they leave behind these institutions only for them to be ending up being filled by native elite. And what that creates is this powerful bureaucratic and military machine that is way stronger than the society it is trying to protect. And this results in the creation of this most countries. India cannot be an example of this, but in most countries it creates this military bureaucratic oligarchy which is autonomous of any sort of social class. Now the problem is that bureaucracy this bureaucracy is now going to be an arbitrator within the local elites themselves, and this disconnect from the people on ground is going to create an administrative dissonance. So rather than exploring or creating laws straightforward in the will of the people, you continue to keep serving those same group of people which constitute of the elite of that populace. Now we see instances of this in many countries when you see a westernized central government that is now trying to pursue rapid nation building or going down the paths of rapid industrialization and leaving behind the people's needs who are now going to feel alienated because they're left out of the process and completely alienated. F.W. Riggs came up with this complementary perspective when he spoke about the idea of the prismatic society. Now, he described that developing countries have a coexisting modern and traditional institutions that don't necessarily always mesh. Now, for example, you could have a shiny new parliament on the Westminster model, and that's operating on a largely illiterate populace. Now, this dissonance that's going to come as a result is going to lead to other forms of corruption and inefficiency within the government that entirely beats the point of building a Westminster model in the first place. Um, on the other hand, you've got Samuel Huntington, who talks about how social mobilization outpaces institutional development. This was in his book called Political Order in Changing Societies. And in that book, basically, he's talking about how order and strong institutions might need to precede full mass democracy in order to be able to avoid chaos. Now, this is a very controversial take because you're basically saying that in this small period of becoming immediately independent, post colonial societies may need a period of guided rule in order to be able to build their capacity. And that same excuse can then also be used to justify autocracy in a lot of countries. So it's a controversial take, but curious to hear your opinion as well. India serves as an interesting case of this because when we were gaining independence, we inherited British forms of state machinery when we're looking at a bureaucracy, a civil service, a judicial, and or a military for that matter. Now, under Indian governments, we deliberately nurtured and protected these institutions of governance and democracy instead of prioritizing sweeping social transformations. So, despite having a constitution, regular elections, and an independent judiciary and a professional bureaucracy, India basically tried to earn its legitimacy through the protection of its democratic institutions. But the problem is that although you are satisfying the liberal emphasis on consent and democracy, you're not really looking at what the people actually need on ground. So that's resulting in you having an English speaking elite that's running the modern state, but a lot of traditional society is remaining aloof from these laws and ending up being alienated from everybody else. So on one side you're pursuing industrialization and rapid growth, and on the other side you're still battling problems like caste. So this duality was has continued to be, in fact, an ongoing challenge. So basically, understanding the post-colonial theory of the state is to understand how colonial structures have impacted post-colonial governance, because now your state is caught in between nation building, uh, assuming a development role, and at the same time reducing its colonial hangover and dynamic, old power dynamics. So scholars like Hamza Alavi, who came out with this concept of the overdeveloped states, or others like Partha Chatterjee, basically emphasize on the need for us to rethink the state from the eyes of the formerly colonized, and not just apply European theories of state onto the people, which was based on concepts of a homogeneous nation and a social contract that emerges from consent. Because the colonial state was not built on consent, it was built on coercion. And recognizing this is very crucial for reform, because then you can make the state truly serve its society rather than have the society live up to this notion or the idea of the state. Now, another domain where colonial influence continues is in development theory. Basically, in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, there were two main paradigms that came to the forefront the most. One was the liberal take on the modernization theory, and the other was the Marxist dependency theory. Though both are very contrasting, the post-colonial mind would have individual critiques for both, for having Eurocentric assumptions as well as for the need for there to be there to be alternative paths for development as well. So the modernization theory or the liberal paradigm basically emerged in Western academia and advised policymakers during the Cold War. It basically saw development as a linear evolutionary path that all countries must go through to become developed like the West and essentially follow the process of the West. Most famously, Walt W. Rostow's model of the five stages of economic growth spoke about how a country could progress from a traditional society to having preconditions for takeoff, have a takeoff, which is rapid industrial growth, have a drive to majority, and then have an age of high mass consumption. Mind you, when you talk about a traditional society here, you're talking about a society that has, say, subsistence agriculture and static social structures, which then, with interventions of urbanization and technology, often through investment from the West, could then marinate the society for it to have preconditions for takeoff. Increased media consumption, urbanization, and integration of this technology would continue to erode old traditional ideals, and once these societies have shedded these old traditions, they would make the people want to aspire to become more like the West. And this, mind you, how traditional here is being coded as backward, and modern here is being coded as advanced in the process. And this is basically a prime example of the Eurocentric lens, because you're judging the global South and societies basis how far along they are on the scale of becoming like the West. Now, modernization theories did although impact and talk about some important aspects like education, institution building, healthcare, and countries like India even have adopted parts of this paradigm into their own development processes. So you've got the 5-year economic plans or the green revolution for that matter. But there's two problems with this. First is that you're trying to blame the victim here. You're saying that if the country is poor, it's because they stuck to their traditions or they choose to be too static and not become more like the West. And essentially, it's therefore it is behind on this universal timeline of progress. But you're ignoring the very historical plunder and giving into the distortions of colonialism in the process. And the second is that this modernization theory comes with a very paternalistic attitude from the West that then covers for new forms of dominance, because you've then got foreign aid or intervention that is now justified to help along the preconditions for takeoff that I mentioned earlier. And the problem is that this aid then comes with strings attached. So we can talk about India for that matter and Indian education policy. After independence, India was trying to focus more on vocational training. Basically, that even if you didn't go to school, you would be equipped with some level of knowledge and know-how to be able to feed yourself and your families, at least from an occupational lens. The second India turned to the IMF for funding, it had to accept something known as structural adjustment programs, which obviously applied to more than education as an industry. But um, India had to India had to agree to promising universal education for all. And mind you, the country at that point in its time was spending less than 4% of its GDP, 4% of its budget on education. And for it to promise universal education to one of the largest populations in the world was very difficult. So your investment went from being targeted to general, and that's something that India is still dealing with the consequences of today. So in reaction, the Marxist paradigm of dependency and underdevelopment gained more prominence, especially in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. You had thinkers like Samir Amin, Andre Gunder Frank, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and these basically argued that third world underdevelopment was basically a product of the global north, and it was actively created by the global capitalist system. Because Andre Gunder Frank famously talks about this in The Development of Underdevelopment, and basically saying that colonialism and ongoing economic exploitation basically produced poverty in the global south as the flip side of wealth in the global north. Because I mean, so Gunder Frank basically talks about the structure of the metropolis and the satellite, where the rich core kept sucking resources from its satellite states, which is the periphery. This idea was further built on by Emmanuel Wallerstein in the world systems theory, that divided the world into core, semi-periphery, and the periphery. So the core is basically your imperial states and later others. Semi-peripheries were the transitioning states, and the periphery is basically the global south and underdeveloped states. So basically, the core continues to control capital, technology, and trade terms, and while the periphery remains underdeveloped because it keeps supplying raw material and labor, and they're obliged to serve the core's interests. And this resources that flow from the periphery to the core continue to persist disparities. Um, Dependency theory basically flips the script. It basically puts pressure on the international systems and says that ex colonies are not backwards because of their traditional or any sort of internal conflict. Rather, they were made poor by the very same process that made the colonizers rich. And now you're not putting the blame on local failures anymore, you're putting the blame on international systems. Because now, for instance, many African and Asian countries, they export raw materials and labor to the global north. But they continue to do so at the same rates that are defined by global markets, that is defined by the global north. And they continue to import manufactured goods at the same rates defined by the global markets, that is also defined by the global north. And this is simply a continuation of the very same colonial pattern that Dadabhai Naoroji would name as drain of wealth. Mind you, drain of wealth came out in 1901. That was way before these dependency theories got famous. That was later in the 1960s. And in that book called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, Dadabhai Naoroji basically talks about how Britain basically betrayed its own professed values, and how Britain was siphoning off India's wealth. And this very extraction was not morally in tandem with British values. That's why he calls it un-British in the process. Funny enough, I mean, Indian nationalists are appealing to British ideals to be able to critique colonialism, but I think that can just call that the hypocrisy of colonial exploitation. Coming back to development paradigms, both modernization and dependency theory give you this big picture explanation of why the world works the way it does today, but each has its own critiques too. I mean, the liberal paradigm is critiqued for um, having this Eurocentrism and implying that there is a singular path for development. But the Marxism dependency paradigm, on the other hand, despite it exposing power imbalances, is also critiqued for its economic determinism and basically not fully accounting for any sort of internal factors or the possibility of agency and change within the periphery. Because you've got examples like the Asian tigers that chose to have their own definition of development. So a lot of these countries in the Southeast Asia, basically what they did was they closed their borders for certain industries and chose to have their own industries grow and develop so they become as competitive with the rest with those of the rest of the world. So you've got Japan doing that in the automobile industry and South Korea doing that in the cellular technology industry, and that led to more nuanced theories being developed in the process. One such evolution would be the world system analysis that I spoke about through Emmanuel Wallerstein, that basically said that countries in the semi-periphery could continue to fluctuate within hierarchies internally as well. It also, you've got socialist models, you've got mixed economies, you've got China's 4-decade rise that acts as an exception to all the development theories you've seen before. Basically, it also led to something known as post-development theories that basically argued that the very notion of development was a very Western imposed narrative that thought and sought Western ideals of society as the norm, and basically flipped the script and asked who gets to define what development is at the end of the day. Um, and post development basically calls for the return of power of the definition back to the communities that live in the very ex colonies themselves, and in essence is this plea to revive local knowledge systems and practices and create for more resilience in the process. Now another crucial element of post-colonial thought is to basically amplify the voices that colonial and imperial narratives try to suppress. So Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, she asked a very provocative question in this seminal essay of hers called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" The subaltern, the word, is borrowed from Antonio Gramsci. It basically talks about the people at the very bottom of the ladder, the marginalized, the colonized, the oppressed, basically the voiceless. And she argued that in the power dynamics of knowledge and representation, these voices often are not heard or acknowledged by the elites, so both by the colonizers as well as the native elite. And even well intentioned scholars may tend to speak over them in trying to speak for them, and that basically obscures their entire message. Now, an example of this can be taken from colonial India, and I ask you to take this concept from the notion and not from its morality. But when we're talking about the practice of women committing the act of sati uh, or self-immolation, basically the British called it and termed it as barbaric and banned it by saying that we're trying to save brown men from brown women. But on the other hand, you've got Hindu traditionalists calling it honorable. But nobody in this entire conflict asked why might have the woman done it for that matter, and this narrative was never truly heard because it was spoken over, and that basically illustrates how the subaltern's agency is erased by dominant narratives in the process. So you've got this post-colonial scholars. There's this subaltern studies group. A notable example could be Ranjit Guha, for that matter. Basically, try to recover history from below. They're going back to the peasants, the tribals, the Adivasis, and others who weren't basically kings or colonials to basically tell their stories and acknowledge the forms of resistance that might have been overlooked for that matter. Because they're trying to insist on the agency of the oppressed. Because although you may have been passive, because they were never just passive victims for that matter, because they were never just passive victims for that matter. They were also they also had overt methods of resistance and proving their own agency, and they also negotiated their identities under colonial rule. And there's this emphasis here on rewriting history for that matter and literature to be able to include those marginal voices in the process that may have been replaced by elite nationalist narratives, which also had replaced the British elite narratives. An influential thinker that I also wanted to mention, although he was not explicitly in my notes for today's video, is Franz Fanon, who wrote this book called The Wretched of the Earth in 1961. This came up in conversation with a friend, so I thought that I could include it in today's video. He basically talks about the psychological dimensions of colonization, and basically he talks about how colonialism imbued in the colonized this notion of an inferiority complex, thinking of the Eurocentric lens as the norm. And in this entire process of how violence and struggle could actually end up becoming cathartic in trying to be able to figure out self worth in the process. So the point here is that Fanon was trying to make here is that colonization, the process of colonization and the process of decolonization is never simply just political and economic. It is also cultural and psychological. And the process of decolonization also involves in freeing the mind from this idea of European superiority. Um, that brings me to talk about cultural identity and hybridity. So, post-colonial societies basically exhibit what Homi Bhabha would call as hybrid identities. That centuries of colonial rule can actually end up creating individuals and communities that are a mix of their indigenous and colonial cultures. And Baba argues that the culture itself, for that matter, is hybrid and liminal, for that matter. So in the colonial encounter, neither the colonizer nor the colonized emerge unchanged, and the colonized basically imbibes in them the colonizers' cultures, and they remix them and reinterpret them as their own. And he famously describes how this hybridity could also become actually a strategy for the suppressed to be able to subvert the authority. So you've got English speaking and English writing authors like Arundhati Roy, who is an Indian, who uses the colonizer's tongue, yet chooses to have their own Indian sensibilities combined into it, and challenging the empire and the notion of the empire from within. So basically, there is this creation of what Homi Baba calls a third space, where there is an in between space which creates new meanings and identities that form under the binary of the colonized and the colonizer. And the main point that I was trying to make here is that post colonial culture is not pure, and it is hybrid, and that hybridity is going to cause some level of ambivalence, but that ambivalence cannot be seen as any form of a weakness. Rather, we can use it as inspiration for creativity and resilience. This is not to say that hybridity does not come with challenges of its own. I mean, there is this sense of cultural imperialism that even continues after independence. So with this preference for all things Western, or for the notion of thinking that a suit is more formal to be worn for a formal event rather than a traditional attire, or basically having this preference for all things Western among formerly colonized societies, is basically called a colonial hangover that I was talking about earlier. And post-colonial thought basically is encouraging an active reflection on these processes, and it also rewards forms of resistance and trying to strive for agency in the process as well. So you've got figures who resisted colonial cultural domination, like Mahatma Gandhi, who spoke about protecting indigenous industries and promoted the use of khadi. There is even this notion in academia of trying to decolonize knowledge now, where you're trying to reclaim ancient philosophies that are non-Western, or oral traditions, or folk wisdom, for that matter, that was tried to be suppressed by the colonizer. Um, and you can see this trend across the world in indigenous knowledge systems. You've got the Australian Aboriginals trying to reclaim their knowledge systems. You've got Native American rights, even in India for that matter, with the entire movement for Adivasi rights. It's basically trying to assert pride in identities that colonialism tried to suppress. Having dissected the hangovers of colonial power, I think we can start to conclude by starting to look at how post-colonial societies have begun to forge alternative paths. A key feature of post-colonial thought is its emphasis on agency. The fact that formerly colonized people are saying that they are no longer bound to Western rules and traditions of society, and are now forging their new paradigms. So, one area of emerging alternatives is in development and in knowledge systems. There is this growing recognition that indigenous knowledge, such as agricultural practices, medicinal practices, or even governance structures for that matter, are often contain wisdom that colonial or Western frameworks were trying to oppress or erase, or actively overlooking. In India, this, for example, when you look at traditional medicine in the form of Ayurveda or Siddha, is now actively being taken into becoming integrated alongside allopathic medicine for a more holistic healthcare. In fact, farmers, for that matter, are now returning to traditional varieties when they realize that despite using high yield varieties that were Western, it made them dependent on purchased seeds and fertilizers. A couple of years ago, there was this group of Western researchers. I think they got a US patent for powdered turmeric for having medicinal healing capabilities, and that is something that every Indian grandmother already knew for decades, for that matter. So India basically contested that patent and had it taken away and exposed it as an act of biopiracy, which is basically the notion of somebody else using traditional knowledge for monopolizing or using it for economic profit. So I think there was a case for neem as well. Um, and these have already been a part of our indigenous knowledge systems. So that also led to in the Indian government and a bunch of other governments to come together to form something known as the TDKL, or the Traditional Digital Knowledge Library, where you're going to be documenting ancient remedies and medicine, and in order to prevent others from patenting what is already a part of your country's culture for decades. These are examples of post colonial assertion saying that our knowledge is not for yours to monopolize, and you're redefining progress on your own terms now. So, politically looking at it, I mean, politically, the legacy of colonialism is also tackled through global solidarities among post-colonial nations, and I think that's beautiful because you get to see it in the form of you got to see it in the form of the aforementioned non-alignment movement during the Cold War era. But even in today's day, I mean, you can look at the BRICS or the G77 or the South-South Cooperation, and basically they are carrying this support of mutual rapport among developing countries that they're trying to come together and they're trying to reform the international system, be it the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, because these institutions were created when newly independent states didn't have much say in the process. But now you're trying to push for this multilateral world where no single bloc or party can unilaterally dictate terms of the world. And that resonates with the post colonial desire for autonomy. Coming to hybrid identities that were once seen as um, something to be ashamed of, or some notion of it is sad to be caught between worlds, now are being embraced as strengths. And I think that's beautiful because post colonial societies can now leverage their dual heritage to act as cultural and economic bridges. Now, in India, for example, um, many people, many Indians, including myself, often pride themselves for being adept in both Eastern and Western norms. The ability to be able to, say, quote Shakespeare and Kalidas in a single breath, or to integrate modern technology with traditional practices. The hybridity with which Homi Baba spoke about um, is can be seen as this sort of a cosmopolitanism that comes from below. And lastly, the critique of Eurocentrism that has remained central throughout. Um, Educational curriculum has continued to be visited because why should the world history courses always be centric around Europe and America only? And a lot of scholars, post-colonial scholars from Asia and Africa are challenging this very notion because there is this conscious effort to make sure that we are not cheap or poor copies of the West. We're autonomous and we have individual and original contributions to make to the global knowledge systems and with the own unique experiences of these countries. To recap today's video and everything we covered today, post-colonialism basically teaches us that the end of the formal empire was not the end of the story because colonialism's influence endures in the form of income inequalities, economic inequalities, the institutions of states that create disconnects with the people, um, dominance in the realms of culture and knowledge systems where Western culture still holds sway. We explored how thinkers like Edward Said's notion of the prejudiced Orientalism gave way to dominance of the East. We explored how Gayatri Spivak implored us to listen to the voice of the subaltern. We explored how scholars such as Hamza Alawi identified the peculiarity of the post-colonial state and how an overdeveloped machine was trying to develop an underdeveloped society. We understood the five optimistic stages of economic growth, and how it contrasts with the theory of the core and the periphery. Um, we basically understood that development is not a one size fits all because countries navigate their own development in their own philosophies. Therefore, there is no right answer to being a better state. Um, we acknowledge how hybrid identities are the living legacy of colonial encounters with all their creative challenges and potential. Um, Most importantly, we highlighted the move towards decolonizing and reclaiming agency. For us as scholars and students, or anybody who is trying to even be an informed citizen, post-colonial thought is very constructive if you live in a developing country, and that's because it critically reminds us to always ask the question of whose perspective is being presented here? Is it a theory or a concept that continues to hold Europe as the norm, or it makes visible the power relations that are embedded in what might seem as neutral knowledge to all of us? And constructively, it encourages the search of alternative visions of the same reality, of society, of economy, of knowledge, and ones that perhaps come from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and beyond. I encourage you to keep in mind India as a living laboratory for post-colonial dynamics. It's a country of proud ancient heritage that is profoundly shaped by British rule, and now, over 75 years into this experiment with democracy, we are forging our and innovating our own path. But at the same time, I urge you to also keep a global perspective, seeing the connections between, say, an African nation that is struggling with debt and an Asian community fighting to preserve its language. Both remain facets of the post colonial condition. I wanted this to be the first video in a series so that I could lay the foundation of the philosophy that I will be approaching a lot of problems with, and hopefully, you guys, if you all made it to the end of this video, maybe I'm going to be seeing you guys in the future videos as well. Um, Thanks for being with me for so far. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and let's get this conversation going. Thank you.